Hello everyone, and welcome to this video on process critiques and substantive critiques. What we're going to be doing is taking a look at these two different ways of critiquing or examining an ethical issue or problem or situation. They are not two different methodologies or precise theoretical ways of critiquing an ethical issue or problem, but they are two broadly different approaches to examining or thinking about ethical issues or ethical situations. And they do result in two very different types of output or types of results from our critique. So we are going to compare and contrast these two different approaches and see the strengths of each, as well as some of the drawbacks and weaknesses of each as well. So if we take the first, which is a process critique, so this is a critique or an approach where we critique an ethical issue, dilemma, or problem by looking at the processes that have led to the negative or problematic outcome. So it could be, I'm just going to look at in a moment, child labor. It could be a conflict of interest. It could be some sort of bullying in the workplace. But the way we understand the ethical issue, or the way that we're trying to explore the ethical issue, we'll be looking at the processes. So be those business processes, economic processes, governance processes. So we're focusing very much on the analysis of the process level. It does give us some useful output in that if we understand the processes that have either allowed the ethical issue or problem to arise, or perhaps have led directly to the ethical issue or problem occurring, then we should be able to identify changes that we can make to those processes to avoid reoccurrence. So it does have a very practical output in that regard. By contrast, when we talk about a substantive critique, we're talking about a very different approach where we're trying to understand some of the underlying dynamics that have led to the ethical issue, dilemma, or problem. So we're not so interested in the precise processes because they may restrict our understanding of some structural or institutional root causes. So we're looking at some fundamental economic forces at play, or perhaps something intrinsic in the clash of structural interests. So we're trying to develop a deeper, more fundamental understanding of the contextual circumstances which have led to the ethical issue or problem arising. Perhaps the best way to understand the differences of these two approaches is to use an example and see what a process critique can tell us and what a substantive critique can tell us, and compare and contrast the two. So we are going to use Nike's use of child labor as our example in this case. We're not going to go through a full critique of the ethical issue, but it's fair to say that there is a significant documentary record of the use of child labor as well as other forms of exploited labor within Nike's supply chain, dating back quite a few decades, as well as significant attempts by Nike to try and combat this. So if we're using a process critique to understand, how did child labor end up within Nike supply chains, and what we can do to try and combat that. Well, we can identify the heavy use of contractors and subcontractors in the supply chain. We can identify these subcontractors and contractors operating in countries where there's relatively weak legal systems in many cases, and significant issues in monitoring and enforcement of labor standards and other rulings and regulations. And lastly, we can also identify that Nike's own monitoring and governance systems within its supply chain and amongst its partners is certainly at various stages being substandard and poor, and therefore contributed to the proliferation of exploitative labor within its own supply chain. So as a result of this process critique and examining the exact processes which led to this problem, we can see that what Nike did and have done at various points is affirm a very public commitment to eliminate child labor within their operation. They develop at a fairly regular pace new governance methods and new techniques within their supply chain management and global supply management functions to meet this commitment. And these have taken the forms of supplier charters, contractors and subcontractor charters, scheduled and unscheduled inspections, various penalties built into the contracts for Nike's partners regarding the use of labor. So there have been quite a lot of significant changes to how Nike actually deals with their supply chain. And a lot of these process changes have been very public as well. So we can see the ethical issue of child labor, not just in the abstract, but within this particular organization and within this particular supply chain, as a failure of several different processes, some of them organizational, so some of them is Nike's processes, some of them the processes of Nike's contractors and subcontractors, and some of them being the processes of the governments of the countries involved. And we can also see various process improvements that could be made. Now, if we take the same issue, so Nike's use of child labor within their supply chain, and we apply a different critical approach, so in this case, let's apply a substantive critique to the issue, we would get a very different set of contributing factors. So here, if we have a substantive critique, if we try and understand not just how child labor ended up in Nike's supply chain, but what were the structural reasons for this. And we can see that certainly Western consumption patterns and the rise of fast fashion and the need for rapid turnarounds, and also in many cases with Nike's a great example of where ballooning costs in other areas, marketing, sponsorship, and so on, have resulted in increasing pressure on actual manufacturing and logistics costs. We add to that the exploitative international trade patterns and flows, so Nike haven't exactly pioneered the kind of outsourcing relationships that have resulted in this multitude of contractor and subcontractor relationships. Rather, they're part of a larger international pattern that have enabled this kind of supply chain to emerge, as well as underlying extractive hypercapitalism logic. So again, the kind of economic pressures are not unique to Nike as a company, but rather are systemic, not just within the clothing and garment industry, although they take very particular forms in the garment industry, but certainly you can, and many academics and thinkers have had a systemic critique of the single global integrated capitalist system, with various countries acting as resource sinks and extracting natural resources, others serving to add value through manufacturing, others serving to add value as consuming manufactured goods, all linking up to a particular type of hypercapitalism, which is fairly unique to the last 40 or 50 years. This helps us understand not just how these particular processes broke down, but rather why there was specific, persistent and structural pressure that kept allowing or kept enabling exploitative labor practices from creeping into supply chains, not just for Nike, but rather for the entire sector and across a range of sectors. The outputs we get from this kind of substantive critique are significantly different from the kind of outputs we would get from a process critique. So here the natural logical suggestion would be systemic change in Western consumption patterns, because ultimately organizations are responding to particular types of consumption patterns, particular patterns of demand and price sensitivity in Western markets, by and large, although that is shifting over the last 20 years or so. So that would be one key driver for these kinds of underlying dynamics that are leading to this ethical issue. Radical reform of international trade patterns and flows, which again allow these kinds of relationships with partners, contractors and subcontractors, and alternative forms of economic activity, ultimately to allow for different types of economic relationships which are not built upon the same kind of extractive logic that we can see typified or certainly an example of in this ethical issue here. This is an extremely different approach, but you can see how both substantive critiques and process critiques are ways of exploring ethical issues and ethical problems, but they will both consider very different types of factors and come to very different conclusions. And that's because ultimately the goal of each approach is very different. A process critique would seek to understand how a particular issue has arisen through the mechanism of particular localized processes, whereas substantive critiques seek to understand the conditions under which particular ethical issues can arise or are incentivized to arise. So we have two different frames of references and therefore two very different types of understanding emerging. What we can do now is take a look at some of the limitations of each approach as well. So if we first look at process critiques, we see some of the limitations illustrated by the contrast with substantive critique. So a process critique can often become lacking in context because we're focused very much on specific processes associated with the ethical issue or ethical problem. Then we do often miss some of the wider context and wider situational forces at play. Another limitation that we can see just by examining the reality of how organizations often deal with ethical issues and problems is that process critiques will often form the bulk or the majority of responses to ethical issues and problems, and they tend to lack long-term meaningful impact. So pledges to establish fact-finding commissions, particularly common when ethical issues or problems arise at the level of governance, local, regional or national governance, establishing task forces, making very public pledges, don't really necessarily lead to long-term change. Nike's use of exploitative labor and child labor is a really good example of this. There was a major PR push, there was a major series of pledges, there were actually real changes made to Nike's processes and governance structures in the wake of the first few waves of revelations and stories and coverage of child labor and exploitative labor practices. However, they have reoccurred on a fairly regular basis. So that suggests either the process changes that are needed to actually eliminate this problem are far too complex for a company the size and sophistication of Nike to implement, which I would have trouble accepting without a lot of evidence, or there is something seriously amiss in the use of these kinds of pledges and governance programs to tackle an issue if they have failed to really eliminate this issue despite it being very publicly associated with Nike, despite very, very high profile attempts to launch initiatives and pledges to eradicate this. And we can see this in many other cases as well. We see this with the recent stories reoccurring now about Apple's involvement in supply chains in the Uyghur region in China. And Apple is one particular company that's invested a lot of money in process critiques of its own supply chains. Rash of suicides in a Foxconn factory about 10 years ago, and other similar kinds of stories. Again, these do keep reoccurring, they do keep popping up. So there is certainly some indication that there are significant limitations to the process critique approach. Now, when it comes to substantive critiques, we have a similar set of well, not a similar set, but a complementary, shall we say, set of limitations that come to light when we contrast it with process critiques. So while process critiques can often provide a stimulus to approach or to enact very specific types of process improvements, very specific types of responses. Substantive critiques often lead to radical proposals to change the existing status quo, which may not be easily manageable or may seem to be very, very radical responses to perhaps relatively isolated ethical concerns or ethical issues, depending on your perspective. So there may be a disconnect, and this is one potential limitation: a disconnect between the solution and the actual inciting problem itself. Solutions often require significant changes by a range of organizations and parties as well. So not just the organizations or corporations involved, but also political institutions and consumers. So lots and lots of different parties. So the actual odds of getting this huge range of stakeholders to behave in a coordinated fashion itself is a stark order and not necessarily a very feasible one. And it often does require a major shift in our understanding of the external environments involved. And again, that's a limitation, that the critique of a particular ethical issue or problem requires a significant shift in how we understand and interpret various external environments. However, I do think there's value in that last point. Simply because there are cases where a shift in our understanding can allow us to examine the problem in a different light. And I'm not going to make any secret of the fact that I think that process critiques are significantly limited. That's my own opinion and my own position. But I think that we can see in some instances allowing us to look at a fairly familiar problem or ethical issue in a different light can sometimes be very, very beneficial and certainly allow for fresh understandings to emerge. What I'm going to do now is take a look at a seemingly unrelated issue. We're going to look at homelessness in the UK, but I think it's a really good example of where a substantive critique can shift the framing of an issue altogether. So if we take a look at a fairly normal process critique of homelessness in the UK, which has been rising for the last 10 years or so, in some cases very starkly so, and we can see the various process weaknesses within existing mechanisms designed to manage homelessness in the UK. So by providing improved access for skills training, educational programs, improved access to alcohol, substance abuse and mental health, which I didn't squeeze onto that box, support services and improving the provision of supported housing, all things which have, all processes and structures which have progressively weakened over the last 10 years or so. What we would expect to see is a reversal of that trend, and would expect to see a reduction, perhaps gradual reduction, or perhaps a marked rapid reduction in homelessness through active intervention and support services. So what the process critique, or what a process critique approach allows us to do, is to try and pinpoint some of the causes for rising homeless numbers in the UK and identify ways that processes can be changed, improved, resources added, additional support services provided and so on, in order to reverse that trend. If we look at a substantive critique, however, it does allow us to examine this issue from a very different perspective. So In this case, if we look at homelessness in the UK and we try and approach it as a systemic problem to be eradicated or removed rather than an issue to be managed, then we actually have quite a bit of data, a lot of research, and a fairly strong understanding of what would be needed in order to actually essentially remove homelessness as a significant public concern, and certainly shifting it to a temporary issue rather than having the problem of long-term persistent homeless numbers on the streets. And it is fairly straightforward. So unconditional housing as an automatic civic right, alcohol, substance abuse and mental health support provided, all of this being paid for through savings from associated homelessness costs, which are emergency healthcare, support services, social services rather, and justice system costs. And we know that this will have a huge step towards eliminating it as a substantive problem in the UK. We know this because there's not only many studies have been done on this. We have the example of Finland, which saw the prism that homelessness was seen through in Finland, like many European countries, experienced rising homeless numbers until the decision was made to, instead of approaching this as a problem to be managed, instead store it as the root causes were identified and it was seen as something to be eliminated, and they have seen huge success from this. We've also seen smaller scale experiments where automatic housing was seen as a foundation to tackle the root causes of homelessness, which often are things like mental health emergencies, often like substance abuse and alcohol abuse issues. But housing was seen as a necessary foundation to allow individuals to tackle their individual root causes. This has been done on city level experiments and other settings, and again is proved to be significantly successful. I would argue that what this allows us to see is that substantive critique, which gives us a fresh approach looking at a particular ethical issue or ethical problem, allows us to see homeless numbers not as a issue of rising homeless numbers, but rather a problem of a structural problem. That the ultimate aim with using substantive critique would be to remove homelessness as a significant long-term persistent problem. Process critique, however, is very much stuck within the exact processes that you're examining the problem through. So if you're looking at the existing processes that treat homelessness as a natural phenomena, that there will always be people that are homeless, and therefore our challenge is to try and manage that through the provision of some support services where we can, then you are going to be limited by the actual foundation that those processes are operating on. It restricts your ability to examine the issue in a wider setting.